By December 1958, Havana had reached the peak of its golden age, a glittering tropical capital where luxury hotels and casinos lined the Malecon, where American celebrities strolled through Art Deco streets, and where chrome-plated convertibles cruised past neoclassical palaces. Within weeks, everything would change. In this video, I use modern AI tools to bring historic photographs, paintings, and maps to life, shifting perspective, changing camera angles, and moving through these scenes in ways their original creators never could. The goal isn't just to look at the past, but to step into it, to walk through Havana as it once was, and imagine what it might have felt like to be there in those final weeks before revolution. And if you stick around until the end, we'll compare these same locations to how they look today, to see what time has preserved and what it has transformed. Before we step into 1958, it helps to understand how Havana became what it was. Founded in 1519 by Spanish colonizers, the city grew around one of the finest natural harbors in the Caribbean. For centuries, it served as a strategic port linking Spain with its American colonies, and this maritime importance shaped its early identity. By the early 20th century, Cuba had gained independence from Spain, though American influence quickly filled the void. Under a series of governments that welcomed foreign investment, Havana transformed into something unprecedented in Latin America, a city where tourism, gambling, and entertainment became major industries. The 1920s brought prohibition to the United States, and Havana became a natural escape for Americans seeking rum, music, and freedom from restrictions. Hotels expanded, nightclubs multiplied, and organized crime began establishing operations that would grow more sophisticated with each passing decade. By the 1940s, American mob figures had recognized Cuba's potential as a gambling paradise just 90 miles from Florida, far closer than Las Vegas and infinitely more exotic. Meyer Lansky, one of the most powerful organized crime leaders in the United States, made Havana his base of operations, establishing relationships with Cuban officials that would prove immensely profitable for both sides. When Fulgencio Batista seized power in a military coup in 1952, he created what the mob had been waiting for, a government willing to fully embrace casino capitalism. New laws encouraged massive investment in hotels and casinos, requiring no disclosure of money sources and imposing minimal oversight. The result was a building boom that reshaped Havana's skyline between 1956 and 1958, producing some of the most extravagant hotel casinos outside of Nevada. By 1958, Havana was rivaling Las Vegas as the Monte Carlo of the Americas, drawing high rollers, celebrities, and tourists from across the world. Yet in the mountains of eastern Cuba, rebel forces under Fidel Castro were methodically advancing toward the capital, and December would mark the beginning of the end. The Hotel Nacional de Cuba stands as perhaps the most recognizable symbol of this era. Completed in 1930, this Spanish Mediterranean resort sits on Taganana Hill overlooking the Straits of Florida, its position giving it commanding views of both sea and city. Designed by the New York architecture firm McKim, Mead and White, the building mixes civilian, Roman, Moorish, and Art Deco styles into something distinctly Cuban. By the 1950s, the National had become far more than just a hotel. Its casino, operated by Meyer Lansky and his associates, was bringing in revenues comparable to the biggest casinos in Las Vegas, and its guest list read like a catalogue of mid-century celebrity. Walking through the National's doors in December 1958, you might have encountered Frank Sinatra at the bar, Ava Gardner by the pool, or any number of Hollywood stars drawn to Havana's unique combination of tropical glamour and permissive atmosphere. The hotel's history bar, still there today, displays photographs from this period, evidence of a world where organized crime figures, entertainers, and political power brokers mingled freely. Just 14 years earlier, in December 1946, the hotel had hosted the infamous Havana Conference, a week-long summit where mob bosses from across the United States gathered to discuss the future of their Cuban operations while Sinatra provided entertainment. By 1958, what had been planned at that conference had become reality, a criminal empire generating millions of dollars monthly from gambling, with a portion flowing directly to President Batista. The Tropicana was Havana's most beloved entertainment venue, famous internationally and locally alike. Set in a lush tropical garden in the Marianao neighborhood, the club featured structures that seem almost impossible, thin-shell concrete and glass buildings designed by Cuban architect Max Borges Recio and constructed between 1952 and 1954. The indoor nightclub, known as Arcos de Cristal, used revolutionary architectural techniques to create vast, open spaces beneath sweeping concrete arches, while the outdoor performance area, Bajo las Estrellas, allowed audiences to watch elaborate shows literally under the stars. The Tropicana's nightly performances were spectacles of choreography, music, and costume, drawing performers and audiences from around the world. Everyone who visited Cuba in the 1950s seemed to make their way to the Tropicana. Liberace performed there, Nat King Cole recorded an album with the Tropicana Band, and countless other entertainers found the club's combination of Caribbean warmth and sophisticated production irresistible. The casino, bearing the name of mobster Lefty Clark, added another dimension to the experience, making the Tropicana both a cultural institution and a profitable gambling operation. In December 1958, the Tropicana continued operating as if nothing was wrong, its nightly shows proceeding as scheduled even as rebel forces closed in on the capital. The Malecon stretched along Havana's northern coast, a seawall and oceanside boulevard that had expanded eastward throughout the 20th century. Originally built in the early 1900s as a maritime promenade for the middle class, by the 1920s it had reached the outer limits of Vedado, and by the early 1950s it had become a 6-lane highway carrying streams of Buicks and Chevrolets from Old Havana to the borders of Miramar. The architecture lining the Malecon told the story of Havana's evolution, neoclassical structures from the early century giving way to Art Nouveau flourishes, then to the bold Art Deco and modernist buildings of the 1930s through 50s. Driving the Malecon in a convertible was the quintessential Havana experience, the ocean on one side, the eclectic cityscape on the other, warm Caribbean air flowing past as you cruised through what felt like the most sophisticated city in Latin America. The Hotel Riviera, Meyer Lansky's ultra-swank, 21-story masterpiece, rose directly on the Malecon, a stunning example of Miami modern design that opened in December 1957 with Ginger Rogers performing at its Cabaret Copa room. The building's spherical casino structure, painted in vibrant colors, became almost as famous as the Hotel Nacional's gaming room. At night, the Malecon transformed into Havana's social center, where teenagers, lovers, families, and friends gathered along what locals called the world's longest sofa, the seawall becoming an informal meeting place for the entire city. The Capitolio Nacional, completed in 1929, stood as Havana's most ambitious architectural statement. Built during the post-World War I sugar boom that brought enormous wealth to Cuba, the building required over 5,000 workers, 3 years, 3 months, and 20 days to construct, at a cost of $17 million. While often compared to the United States Capitol, the Capitolio was actually modeled more closely on the Pantheon in Paris, though its dome, reaching 92 meters in height, was slightly higher than its Washington counterpart. The entrance featured 6 rounded Doric columns atop a 55-step staircase, with 2 giant statues by Italian sculptor Angelo Zanelli flanking the approach. Inside, the Salón de los Pasos Perdidos, this Room of the Lost Steps, named for its unusual acoustics, contained the magnificent statue of the Republic, a 17-meter bronze woman covered in gold leaf and weighing 30 tons. A replica of a 24-carat diamond set in the floor beneath the dome marked 0 kilometer for all highway distances in Cuba. The Capitolio served as the seat of the Cuban Congress until 1959, making it the center of whatever democratic processes existed under Batista's increasingly authoritarian rule. In December 1958, legislators continued their work inside these palatial halls, perhaps sensing that their time was running out, but unable or unwilling to acknowledge how close the end had become. Old Havana preserved centuries of Spanish colonial architecture, narrow streets lined with buildings dating back to the 16th and 17th centuries. The Cathedral Square, with its Baroque church and surrounding colonial structures, remained largely unchanged from earlier eras. This historic core contrasted sharply with the modern development spreading through Vedado and along the Malecon, creating a city where multiple time periods coexisted. In December 1958, Old Havana still functioned as a living neighborhood, not yet the restored tourist district it would become decades later. Its colonial architecture housing families, businesses, and the everyday life of ordinary Cubans largely invisible to tourists focused on the glamorous hotel district. The streets of Havana were filled with American cars from the 1940s and 50s, Chevrolets, Fords, Buicks, and Cadillacs in every color imaginable. These vehicles, many purchased during the prosperous years when Cuba ranked among Latin America's wealthiest nations, symbolized the close economic ties between Cuba and the United States. In December 1958, these chrome-plated automobiles still looked relatively new, their owners maintaining them carefully and taking pride in their possession. No one could have guessed that within a generation, these same cars would become frozen in time, kept running through improvisation and ingenuity long after American spare parts became unavailable, eventually becoming one of Cuba's most recognizable symbols. Beyond the casino hotels and tourist districts, Havana in 1958 was a city of stark contrasts. While the Hotel Nacional and Tropicana represented unprecedented luxury, much of Cuba's rural population lived in poverty. The wealth generated by sugar exports and tourism flowed primarily to Havana and to those connected with Batista's government, while conditions in the countryside remained difficult. This inequality, combined with government corruption and political repression, had been fueling opposition to Batista since his 1952 coup. By 1958, that opposition had coalesced around Castro's 26th of July movement, which had been waging guerrilla warfare from the Sierra Maestra Mountains since 1956. While Havana celebrated through December 1958, Castro's forces were achieving decisive victories in eastern Cuba. The Battle of Santa Clara, which began on December 31st, would prove the final blow. Led by Che Guevara and Camilo Cienfuegos, rebel forces captured this strategically vital city, cutting Cuba in half and making Batista's position untenable. Around midnight on January 1st, 1959, Batista realized his government could not survive. By 3 in the morning, he had boarded a plane at Camp Columbia with 40 supporters and family members, fleeing to the Dominican Republic and taking with him a personal fortune estimated at over $300 million. As news of Batista's flight spread through Havana, angry citizens began attacking the casinos that symbolized corruption and foreign exploitation, smashing slot machines and setting fires. Now, I want to bring you into the present and show how these places look today. Thanks for being here. And if you have thoughts or requests for future cities, share them in the comments. Let's get into it. The Hotel Nacional still stands in its commanding position overlooking the sea, one of the few buildings from this era maintained in something close to its original condition. While the casino closed in 1960 when Castro nationalized the hotels, the building itself was preserved, serving as accommodation for foreign officials and diplomats during the lean decades when tourism nearly disappeared. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba reopened to tourism and the Hotel Nacional was restored, its Art Deco details and historic bars recreated. Today it operates as a 5-star hotel where visitors can walk the same halls that once hosted mob bosses and movie stars, though the atmosphere is considerably more subdued than in 1958. The Tropicana remarkably remains in operation, making it one of the few venues from the pre-revolution era still functioning in its original capacity. The magnificent concrete and glass structures designed by Max Borges Rezio survived both the revolution and the difficult decades that followed. While the casino closed permanently in 1960, the nightly shows continue, still performed under the stars at Bajo las Estrellas and inside the glass-walled Arcos de Cristal. The choreography, costumes and musical traditions established in the 1950s have been preserved, making the Tropicana a living connection to Havana's golden age, though the audiences now consist mainly of tourists rather than the international celebrities who once filled its seats regularly. The Malecon remains Havana's social center, still called the Big Sofa or living room by locals who gather there every evening. However, the buildings lining this iconic boulevard tell a story of struggle and neglect. The Art Deco and modernist structures that looked so pristine in 1958 have suffered decades of exposure to salt spray, hurricanes, and deferred maintenance. Many facades are crumbling. Some buildings have collapsed entirely, leaving gap-toothed spaces in the once continuous streetscape. Restoration efforts have saved some structures, particularly in the stretch closest to Old Havana, but much of the Malecon's architectural heritage remains in precarious condition. The Hotel Riviera still stands, its distinctive spherical casino structure now painted in faded colors, a shadow of its former glamour. The Capitolio underwent a massive restoration between 2013 and 2019, reopening just in time for Havana's 500th anniversary. After serving as the seat of Congress until 1959, the building housed the Cuban Academy of Sciences and the National Library of Science and Technology until 2013, when restoration work began. The 8-year project meticulously returned the building to its original splendor, restoring the bronze statues, repairing the dome structure, and recreating period details throughout the interior. Today, guided tours allow visitors to explore the Salón de los Pasos Perdidos, see the Statue of the Republic in its restored glory, and walk through spaces that witnessed Cuba's tumultuous political history. The Capitolio now stands as one of Havana's best preserved landmarks from the pre-revolution era. Old Havana has been the focus of extensive restoration, efforts led by the Office of the City Historian. Beginning in the 1990s, these projects have saved hundreds of colonial buildings from collapse, recreating the Baroque and neoclassical streetscapes that existed in 1958 and earlier. The Cathedral Square and surrounding streets now look better than they did in the final years before the revolution, when many historic structures had been neglected. However, this restoration has transformed Old Havana into primarily a tourist district. Its colonial buildings now housing restaurants, hotels, museums and shops, rather than the everyday residential life they contained in 1958. The American cars from the 1940s and 50s remain perhaps the most visible connection to pre-revolution Havana. cut off from American parts and unable to import new vehicles during the decades of embargo, Cubans kept these cars running through remarkable improvisation, swapping in Soviet diesel engines, fabricating replacement parts by hand, and maintaining bodies through constant repair. What began as necessity became identity, and today these vintage automobiles, painted in bright colors and kept in remarkably good condition, serve as tourist taxis offering rides along the Malecon and through old Havana. Sitting in a 1957 Chevrolet convertible, cruising past the Hotel Nacional, creates an almost surreal sense of time displacement, as if 1958 never quite ended. The glamorous nightlife that defined Havana in 1958 disappeared almost completely after the revolution. When Castro nationalized the casinos and hotels in 1960, the mob departed, taking with them the enormous flow of money that had funded the city's entertainment industry. The Sans Souci casino was destroyed by arsonists during the chaos of January 1959. Most of the other casinos were converted to different uses or simply closed. For decades, Havana's nightlife existed primarily for locals rather than tourists, modest venues where salsa and sun could still be heard, but nothing approaching the spectacle of the Tropicana in its prime. Only recently, as tourism has gradually returned, have some elements of the old nightlife culture begun re-emerging, though in vastly different form. I do really appreciate you watching. Your ideas, input, and constructive feedback really do shape what comes next. Feel free to leave a comment below. Until next time.